This is our first week right now, starting today until next Sunday. Our chapter is 1 to 5, and it's going to average to about 70 pages a week, which is 10 pages a day. So that works perfectly. That's always what we aim for. If you can read 10 pages a day, then you're right on track. And if you can't, if you suffer some weeks, right, if you get busy, if kid stuff comes up, work stuff comes up, that's okay. That's why our community exists, so that myself, Michelle, other people in the community can help keep you on pace, can help by sharing the passages, by sharing the ideas. We have sessions with therapists who come in and talk to us about some of the concepts from this book. And so even on weeks that you slip up and aren't able to keep up with the reading, you'll still be able to get so much out of it just by being part of the community. So this is our week 1. Week 2 will be chapters 6 to 9, then chapters 10 to 15, and finally the last 4 chapters. So that's what we're going to look at over the next month for all who are interested. And throughout that, we're going to be sharing passages and ideas from Alice Miller's The Body Never Lies. This is, again, our side book, so you don't necessarily need to read this one. If you just read this one, that's going to be enough for now, and let us do the heavy lifting of sharing the ideas and concepts of this book. But of course, if you're like me and like to have 3-4 books going at the same time, that's a great one, and you're really going to enjoy Alice Miller's book as well. How do I find the Discord? You just click the link in the bio, register through there. All right, with that, let's get going. So in chapter 1, he begins, how I said that my favorite parts of this book are all the case stories. He begins with one of those. Mary was a Native woman in her early 40s. She was a very kind and loving woman, but seemed very private and reserved. She ended up getting Raynaud's, which is actually something that Michelle suffers from. It affects your what's the word that I'm looking for? Not blood flow. There's a better word for blood flow. Your circulation. It affects your circulation, and so, for example, the way it manifests for Michelle is her hands and feet get super, super cold in winter. She's always freezing. If you touch her hands or her feet during winter, especially, they feel like ice. So, it can manifest in many different ways. That's how it manifests for her. And so this lady, Mary, this case study that he shares from his time working with patients, she started with Raynaud's, and then eventually it developed into scleroderma, which is much worse. And on a whim, he decided to ask her about her past. And he talks a lot about, in the beginning of this book, about how in the medical profession, they never ask you about, what's actually going on in your life, right? Like your stresses and what's happening. They only ask about the medical things. What do your hands feel like? What kind of pains are you experiencing? And his interaction with Mary was kind of the beginning of this journey for him in the combination of mind and body, recognizing that they are not separate entities. They are one entity that works together. And so, and that came about because one day he decided to ask Mary about her story, right? On a whim, he just asked her. They had some time. He decided to book an hour-long session instead of the few minutes that we each get with our doctors, and started asking her about her background. And what came out of that was such a incredible story and heartbreaking story. And that was kind of the beginning of the journey for Gabor Mate with the connection of mind and body. So I just wanted to read a little bit about her story because I think there's probably a lot in it that many people can resonate with, if not exactly the way it is, then similarities, right? So let's read. So he says, one day, almost on a whim, in response to a whisper of intuition that she needed to be heard, I invited Mary to make an hour-long appointment so she would have the opportunity to tell me something about herself and her life. Thank you, Alan. When she began to talk, it was a revelation. Beneath her meek, indifferent, diffident manner was a vast store of repressed emotion. Mary had been abused as a child, abandoned and shuttled from one foster home to another. She recalled huddling in the attic at the age of 7, cradling her younger sister in her arms while the drunken foster parents fought and yelled below. I was so scared all the time, but as a 7-year-old, I had to protect my sisters, and no one protected me. And can I get a little, when I read that, I right away was like, I'm certain that so many people can resonate. That's such a powerful line that no one protected me. So can you, anybody in chat, if you if that resonates with you, if you had the experience of being a child and this feeling, whether it came at that time, whether you had that realization in that moment or later on in life of not being protected, not having anyone protect you, please just drop something in chat, some emoji or hand up or me or whatever, right? This idea of there was no one to protect me. And for those who had siblings, that's often the case of I had to protect someone else, even though I was was not at an age where I should be protecting anyone. I had to protect other people while nobody was protecting me. The book is our book of the month that we're starting today, When the Body Says No. Yes, I wasn't protected. Me, yes. Yes, 100%. Well, my chronic illness began at 19, right? So as we go through this book, you'll see that the question he keeps asking is, why that time, right? What was going on in your life? Because he talks about how oftentimes there was stuff that was building beneath the surface, but then one event or a very stressful time in your life will trigger that to start to manifest later in life. So asking what happened at 19, what was going on in your life? Yes, sounds like a lot of people relate with that feeling of not being protected. So he says, continuing here, she had never revealed these traumas before, not even to her husband of 20 years. She had learned not to express her feelings about anything to anyone, including herself. To be self-expressive, vulnerable, and questioning in her childhood would have put her at risk. Her security lay in considering other people's feelings, never her own. She was trapped in the role forced on her as a child, unaware that she herself had the right to be taken care of, to be listened to be thought worthy of attention. And we've talked about this a lot on the stream here, about this idea that like the things that that no longer serve us now were actually began as a self-protective mechanism. Right? So considering other people's feelings, being very empathetic, always recognizing what other people are feeling, what their emotions are, what state they are, that began as a self-protective mechanism. As he says here, to be self-expressive, vulnerable, and questioning in childhood would have put her at risk. If you have a parent who's very short-tempered, who believes kids should be seen but not heard, and you're the way kids are, right? Very expressive, a lot of emotions, always asking questions, always kind of arguing, trying to find their place in the world, that doesn't work in many families, right? Especially in abusive families. You can't be that kind of person. And so you learn, your body learns, whether consciously, subconsciously, that the safest way to be is to repress all that, to bring it all inwardly, to have your own experiences inside your body, inside your head, while not letting any of it out. And of course, as we grow up, that doesn't leave us, right? That was built in over years and years and decades at a time. And so when it's time for us to be out there, to be expressive, to share our feelings, to ask for help, we don't have that language. We don't have that ability. In fact, that the idea of it fills us with fear because it's what we know as danger, right? Doing any of that stuff is dangerous for us. That's what we believe. And so we repress, and oftentimes we go decades and we don't even recognize why we're doing it. And this is one of those reasons. He says, Mary described herself as being incapable of saying no, compulsively taking responsibility for the needs of others. How many people can relate with that, hey? Her major concern continued to be her husband and her nearly adult children, even as her illness became more grave. Was the scleroderma her body's way of finally rejecting this all-encompassing dutifulness? I feel like I'm not pronouncing that right. Perhaps her body was doing what her mind could not. And this is kind of the key. This is the idea of all these illnesses and diseases. It's the body's way of doing something that the psyche cannot. Perhaps her body was doing what her mind could not. throwing off the relentless expectation that had been first imposed on the child and now was self-imposed in the adult, placing others above herself. All right, Michelle, are you there? Michelle? Sorry, trying to get the pup out of here because she wants out. And then Gabor then wrote this article about this idea, right, that the body is, well, let me read what he says. He says, when we have been prevented from learning how to say no, our bodies may end up saying it for us. So this idea that if we can't slow down, if we can't say no to things, if we can't take a moment to rest, our body's going to force us to do so. Unfortunately, it's not in productive ways, right? It's through illness and disease. Either way, you get stopped in your track, whether you're going to do it consciously as a self-care mechanism, or whether you're going to force your body to do it for you in less positive ways. Your body's going to find a way to slow down, a way to stop giving to others what you don't give to yourself. That's the thesis, at least, of this. He says, we attempt to understand the body in isolation from the mind. We want to describe human beings, healthy or otherwise, as though they function in isolation from the environment in which they develop, live, work, play, love, and die. And this is kind of the big idea of his most recent book, The Myth of Normal, that beyond the trauma of childhood, this is also a societal problem, right? When we have tension, when we have anxiety, when we have stress built into our society, right, in day-to-day living, that's obviously going to manifest in different ways, in the ways of illness, chronic pain, disease, and all that. So I haven't actually finished that book, so I won't talk too much about it, but I know that's the core idea. Hold on, let me let the pup out of here for a sec. All right. Has anybody read The Myth of Normal? It's just interested to hear your thoughts for anybody who's read it. I'm driving to Barnes & Nobles now to buy this book. Yes, and anybody who's going to read this, if you're going to read it, come join our book club, right? We've just started it today, so you might as well come read it in a community that's supportive, loving, everybody on the same similar journey. And we work with therapists, with counselors, social workers. They have multiple sessions every week around the ideas from the book to help us integrate and evolve our self-healing journey. So if you'd like to join us through that, just click the link in my bio and you can find out all about it. There's a 1 week free trial there, so you could just try it out for a week, see what the community is all about, and decide if it's something that's right for you. I see the comment, this is literally making me cry as I feel it's my story. That's a very prevalent feeling that so many people who read this book, because there's a lot of stories in here, and without a doubt, you're going to find something that resonates with you, and you're going to feel like, wow, that just gave me the language I didn't have to explain my own experience. It's such a prevalent feeling while reading this book of like, wow, that's exactly what I went through. I just didn't know how to explain it. I'll speak more on the subscription later, but all the information's there in my link in my bio, but I will speak about it at the end. So now he moves on. This is still the beginning of the book, right? So chapter 1. So he now spends a bit of time discussing this philosophy. It's not even really a philosophy anymore. The fact that the mind and body are linked, and what happens in our body, what happens in our mind, our thoughts, our emotions, they all impact how our body reacts. We know this as a fact now. Back when this book was released, it was a little more out there. But by now, it's a cold stone fact that what we experience internally is going to manifest. The body will react to it in one way or another. So this is a little more on that. The more specialized doctors become,
the more they know about a body part or organ, and the less they tend to understand the human being in whom that part or organ resides. In this volume, I set out to write about effects of stress on health, particularly of the hidden stress we all generate from our early programming, a pattern so deep and so subtle that it feels like a part of our real selves. And those in the book club know that we just spent an entire month going through that idea in the book, The Four Agreements, right? What he calls self-domestication, that we have, originally we were domesticated by our parents, by our primary caregivers, by our friends, by our teachers, by religion, by society. As we were, while we were growing up as kids, we were programmed to believe certain things, to take in certain things into ourselves. And then later in life, we took those voices, we took those lessons and instilled them inside ourselves and believed that they were part of us, that they were truth. And so a part of the idea of this book that we just looked at all month long is the idea of how do we excavate that? How do we come back to our true self, recognize that a lot of the beliefs, a lot of the thoughts, the ideas that we have living inside us are not true and are not ours, right? So if you want to, a little bit more on that, this is a great book for that. And so that's what he calls programming. Don Miguel Ruiz calls domestication. Although I have presented as much of the available scientific evidence as seemed reasonable in the work for the lay public, the heart of this book, for me at least, is formed by the individual histories I have been able to share with the readers. It so happens that those histories will also be seen as the least persuasive to those who regard such evidence as anecdotal. And so there's a lot of that, right? A lot of case histories. And so for anybody who feels like, oh, that's not real science, he shares a lot of the science as well. And he says here, there is compelling evidence advanced by scientists from many fields that an intimate relationship exists between the brain and the immune system. An individual's emotional makeup and the response to continued stress may indeed be causative in the many diseases that medicine treats, but whose origin is not yet known. Diseases such as scleroderma and the vast majority of rheumatic disorders, the inflammatory bowel disorders, IBS, for example, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and legions of other conditions. Most jarringly, cancer. We'll look at a lot of the cancer research that he shares, which is just fascinating, in a bit of a scary way. And he stresses again, our immune system does not exist in isolation from daily experience. For example, the immune defenses that normally function in healthy young people have been shown to be suppressed in medical students under the pressure of final examination. Of even greater implication for their future health and well-being, the loneliest students suffered the greatest negative impact on their immune systems. And he talks a little about that, and we've looked at a bunch of books that discuss that. Most notably for me, a great book for that is this book, Cured, by Dr. Jeff Rediger, where one of the big theses of the book is that loneliness and detachment from other people is a huge contributor to a suppression of our internal system that keeps disease and illness at bay. Right, so if you're interested in that, that's a great book for that. When emotions are repressed, this inhibition disarms the body's defenses against illness. Repression, disassociating emotions from awareness and relegating them to the unconscious realm, disorganizes and confuses our physiological defenses so that in some people these defenses go awry, becoming the destroyers of health rather than its protectors. And that's a line that I now repeat all the time from Edith Eger's The Gift. She says, what comes out of us doesn't make us sick. She's talking about repressed emotion, especially anger. Says, what comes out of us doesn't make us sick. What stays in there does. The opposite of depression is expression.
right? So letting out that anger, many people think, oh, I shouldn't do that. There's a lot of self-help people who will say, always positive thinking. Anger is a destructive mechanism. And a lot of these books that we read discuss the exact opposite, that the expression of it is what heals us, not the repression. The repression, keeping it in, is the thing that makes us sick. When there is anger, allow that anger to exist. Don't repress it, because when we do, then the body manifests it in its own destructive way. Not even in the West, down here, is mind-body thinking completely new. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates quotes Thracian doctor's criticism of his Greek colleagues. This is the reason why the cure of so many diseases is unknown to the physicians of Hellas. They are ignorant of the whole. For this is the great error of our day in the treatment of the human body, that physicians separate the mind from the body. You cannot split mind from body, said Socrates, nearly 2.5 millennia before the advent of that word that I'm not going to try and pronounce. Right. And if you think to your own experience, especially people who have had a lot of chronic illness, pain, disease, if you think of your own experience, how often do the doctors that you see, the specialists that you see, talk to you about your mindset, about your experiences in life, about your stress levels, right? There is a little more of that these days than there used to be, but it's still such a small sect of the medical establishment, isn't it? The author of Cured is Dr. Jeff Rediger. Yeah, passive aggressive is a form of suppression too, for sure. Whoops. Let me know if this resonates, whether it's your mother or father, one of your primary caregivers. Put a hand up or drop an emoji if you resonate with this. My mother was rarely up to the tender smiles and undivided attention. A developing infant requires to imprint a sense of security and unconditional love in his mind. I learned early that I had to work for attention to burden my mother as little as possible, and that my anxiety and pain were best suppressed. Yeah, I'd love to know this second sentence here, especially who resonates with that. I learned early that I had to work for attention, to burden my mother as little as possible, and that my anxiety and pain were best suppressed. And so, of course, if we go through our entire childhood like this, if we learn deep down at our core that don't burden other people, deal with stuff by yourself, suppress it so it doesn't overwhelm, there's no reason why that would disappear as we age until we do the work, right? Clearly, if we internalize those concepts, those ways of being, they're going to continue to exist. But what served us as children, because it was self-protective, as we spoke about, then as adults, does the exact opposite, right? It suppresses our true self. It doesn't allow us to exist the life that we want to live, that we need to live, that we should live, and so our body rebels against that inauthenticity. With dad, not with mom. Yeah, with either of the parents. We were not allowed to cry. Yes. I think my mom used to pinch me to stop crying. Yeah, my dad shared a similar story that was really, when I heard, I was like, oh, geez. I didn't even have the memory of, but pinching as well. I always read the best books. I do my best. I read a lot of books that I don't think are the best, but I share the ones I do. Not allowed to cry, yes. And so here he starts, he moves through different kind of diseases that are very common, that a lot of people suffer from, and that he's worked with a lot of patients. So the first one he covers is MS. Right, so he says, he talks about research about MS, excessive emotional involvement with a parent, a lack of psychological independence, an overwhelming need for love and affection, and the inability to feel or express anger have long been identified by medical observers as possible factors in the natural development of the disease being MS.
Another study compared MS patients with a group of healthy controls. Severely threatening events were 10 times more common and marital conflict 5 times more frequent in the MS group. Of the 8 women with multiple sclerosis I spoke with, only one was still in her first long-term relationship. The others had separated or divorced. 4 of the women had been abused physically or psychologically by their partners sometime before the onset of illness. In the remaining cases, their partners had been emotionally distant and unavailable. So even though this is a small study, obviously, with 8 women, there's many, many studies that he shares, so you put them all together. But how crazy is it that these 8 women that he spoke to with MS, right, 4 of them had been abused outright, and the other 4 had partners who were emotionally distant and unavailable. And this continues throughout the book of these patterns that are so well ingrained and so systematic that doctors, nurses can predict with almost precise accuracy which people in a group will have a specific illness before doing the test, just based on their personality alone. And we'll look at some of those fascinating studies as we go on. The MS patients described in the stress literature, and all the ones I interviewed, this is such a powerful section, have been placed in positions akin to that of the unfortunate laboratory animals in the Chicago study, which is a study he does here on rats. They were exposed to acute and chronic stress by their childhood conditioning, and their ability to engage in the necessary flight or fight behavior was impaired. The fundamental problem is not the external stress, such as the life events quoted in the studies, but an environmentally conditioned helplessness that permits neither of the normal responses, a fight or flight. The resulting internal stress becomes repressed and therefore invisible. Eventually, having unmet needs or having to meet the needs of others is no longer experienced as stressful. It feels normal. One is disarmed. And so most of us think, doing too much for other people, we're going to feel the stress of that. And he says we do it for long enough, and that stress it doesn't actually disappear, but it feels like it's disappeared. We no longer have the response of fight or flight for things that aren't making us happy. So we have effectively been disarmed, or as the 4 agreements will say, we have become fully domesticated. Powerful. I thought this was interesting. It's a little kind of off where we're talking about, but I found this super interesting that he talks about that a lot of people who suffer from a lot of this stuff, they are artists at heart, and many of them express themselves through their art. But he says artistic expression by itself, meaning just doing the work, the painting, the writing, whatever it is, artistic expression by itself is only a form of acting out emotions, not a way of working them through. And that's, I feel like a lot of people would disagree with that, saying, my art is my way of working through it. And his philosophy is that only if we take it a step further, right, reflecting out what brought that art out, what are the emotions behind the art, what is the desire and need that comes out of that art, not just on the art themselves. Drawing the picture itself, while healing in some ways, is not the ultimate healer. It's not enough to heal that stuff. We need that, just the expression of the pain. It is not the excavation of the pain. I thought that was a really fascinating little line. My friend has MS and she expresses herself very little, no expression of anger. Yeah, that's exactly what he talks about throughout the book. Listen to this. For those habituated, right, getting those people used to high levels of internal stress since early childhood, it is the absence of stress that creates unease, evoking boredom and a sense of meaninglessness. People may become addicted to their own stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. To such persons, stress feels desirable, while the absence of it feels like something to be avoided. Which, how fascinating. I think probably a lot of us have noticed that in ourselves, that anytime we have the opportunity to stop, right, to just sit, to just be, it feels incredibly uncomfortable, right? We always feel like we need to be doing something. There's always this sense, as he says, unease, evoking boredom and a sense of meaninglessness, right? Go, 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 because we have been trained, we have become addicted to the hormones that come from stress. So anything where those hormones aren't pumping through our body feels very boring, very stale, right? Without meaning. And so that's something that I've really, for myself, had to really reflect on and really try and integrate this idea into my life, because the act of stillness was so difficult, especially before I began meditating. The act of just sitting and being is so, still to this day, still feels so foreign and uneasy, uncomfortable. Right? Who resonates with that? Yeah, sense of restlessness, right? And now everybody just says, oh, that's just my ADHD. And while it may be, while it may in part, it's also this idea of having been used to stress, having integrated stress into our day-to-day existence. And so that's the big practice of meditation, right? It's not about achieving anything or getting anywhere. It's just sitting and observing what is. And at the beginning, for most of us, if you have an experience at all like the one I had, this act of stillness, of just sitting and observing, there's a reason they say it is the easiest, hardest thing you'll ever do, because all you have to do is just sit and observe what your mind is doing. But that feels like the most uncomfortable thing in the world, and the mind is going to be so heavily resistant to that. It's going to start talking about, what you have to do the rest of the day, what you should eat, what you have to, going to the grocery store, what's going to be for dinner, what the kids are doing, what work is left undone, right? All the millions of things, so that there's no stillness in the mind, because it doesn't want stillness. It's addicted to the adrenaline, to the cortisol. It wants us to keep going, always be thinking, always be planning, always be doing, right? Why John Kabat-Zinn says you are a human being, not a human doing. You can purchase the book anywhere where you would purchase books. Amazon, bookstores, the library, anywhere. It's a very popular book, so it shouldn't be difficult to find it. And again, if you're going to buy the book now and start the book now, please come join us in our book club. We're just starting today. Come do it with us in a safe and supportive environment. We work with therapists and counselors to guide us through the book. Okay, what time is it here? We got a few minutes left. This really gets, this is a heavy part of these early chapters. Let's read. There's an extensive documentation of the inhibiting effect of chronic stress on the immune system. In one study, the activity of immune cells called natural killer cells were compared in two groups: spousal caregivers of people with Alzheimer's disease and age and health matched controls. So these are people who take care of Alzheimer's patient, and a control group that does not, right? NK cells are frontline troops in the fight against infections and against cancer, having the capacity to attack invading microorganism and to destroy cells with malignant mutations. The NK cells functioning of the caregivers were significantly suppressed, even in those whose spouses had died as long as 3 years previously. So the cells that help us fight off diseases are suppressed when we live in stress, right? Even after that stressor has passed. The caregivers who reported lower levels of social support also showed the greatest depression in immune activity, just as the loneliest medical students had the most impaired immune system under the stress of examinations. So kind of the core idea from that is, if you're going through stressors, at the very least, find your support system, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's a community like ours. The important thing is that we're all going to go through some stressors in our life. Suffering is inevitable, as the Buddhists always say. okay? At the very least, what we need to do is surround ourselves with a group of people, at least a few people who will support us so that we don't feel alone. We don't feel lonely, because that loneliness is just as destructive as the stress itself. And once again, the book Cured by Dr. Jeff Rediger is a great book about that idea. That was me, a caregiver to my dementia mom, and then I got cancer. Oof. Sorry to hear that, Stella. It's so tough when it's people, whether we love them out of duty or out of actual love. There are these people in our lives that we feel responsibility to, and how can we not take on that stress, right? It's possible in certain situations, and probably advisable for some people to not take that on, but that's such a hard thing. We're so wired to take care of our parents, and unfortunately, I hear those stories all the time of how destructive it is to our own being to be the caregiver for others, especially when there's a lot of trauma or conflict in those relationships, when it's done out of duty rather than out of, desire. Another study of caregivers assessed the efficacy of immunization against influenza. In this study, 80% among the non-stressed control group developed immunity against the virus, but only 20% of the Alzheimer caregivers were able to do so. That is incredible, that spread of 80 to 20, right? So you're taking a vaccine, immunization for whatever, 80% of the people who didn't have that stressor were able to intake that immunization and have their body use it as intended, and only 20% of the stressed out caregivers were able to do so. That's incredible. That's not, just like 60 to 50% or 60 to 40, right? 80-20 is a massive split. The stress of unremitting caregiving inhibited the immune system and left people susceptible to influenza. Research has also shown stress-related delays in tissue repair. The wounds of Alzheimer caregivers took an average of 9 days longer to heal than those of controls. Whew. Nurses for sure have a lot of this sort of stuff, and usually, in my experience, at least I found in discussing, my sister is also a nurse, that they become nurses because there's, at least in part, there is some of that already built into them. This idea of caregiving at your own expense is already built in, and that's why they're drawn to that profession. And so there is definitely, I think he actually does talk about nurses later in the book specifically. Higher levels of stress cause higher cortisol output, and cortisol inhibits the activity of inflammatory cells involved in wound healing. Dental students had a wound deliberately inflicted on their hard palates while they were facing immunology exams, and again during vacation. In all of them, the wound healed more quickly in the summer. Under stress, their white blood cells produce less of a substance essential to healing. And that's, as this book kind of posits throughout it, this is true for all of us. It's not just these professions or these high stress times, for specific, groups of people. It is we're using these as examples to show what is happening in all of us. Then when our stress levels are exceptionally high, our entire immune system suffers. We'll continue with that. What has happened is that we have lost touch with the gut feelings designed to be our warning system. The body mounts a stress response, but the mind is unaware of the threat. We keep ourselves in physiologically stressful situations with only a dim awareness of distress or no awareness at all. If you think about whether it's family life that's not healthy, right? Caregiving, abusive relationships, toxic work environments, how often do we just kind of grit our teeth and bear it and keep going? For most people, it's a big part of the human experience, is gritting your teeth and going through the stressors. And eventually, we know that from our body. Think of like when you smell something that smells really bad, right? You stay around that smell long enough and the body just stops the focus on it, and suddenly you don't smell it anymore. Right? And it's the same thing with the stress. Eventually, we are in a stressful situation enough, and we stop becoming aware of just how stressed we are. It becomes the new normal, right? That's one of the taglines of the myth of normal, is the new normal. The higher, this is fascinating here, the higher the level of economic development, it seems, the more anesthetized we have become to our emotional realities. We no longer sense what is happening in our bodies and cannot therefore act in self-preserving ways. The physiology of stress eats away at our bodies, not because it has outlived its usefulness, but because we may no longer have the competence to recognize its signals. And that's why we talk so much here about awareness, why it's so critical to everything to do with self-healing, to just practice some self-awareness, to start to recognize what is happening in my mind, in my body right in this moment, right? That's kind of the core idea of mindfulness, of meditation, of yoga, of sound healing. All this stuff is to come back to the body, to come back to the present, and to just observe what is happening right now, right? Without that self-awareness, we can't create the distance that allows us to act against that, right? And so that's why that building that muscle of awareness of what is happening in my mind and body right now is so critical, because without it, how can we institute any change? So this, a child whose parents punish or inhibit this acting out of emotion will be conditioned to respond to similar emotions in the future by repression. We're talking about anger, any kind of extreme emotions, right? The self-shutdown serves to prevent shame and rejection. That's fascinating. Again, this idea of it's serving us in some way. These things that end up hurting us began as self-serving mechanisms, self-protective mechanisms. The self-shutdown serves to prevent shame and rejection, right? So if every time you're angry, you get in trouble as a child and you are made to feel shamed or guilty, then eventually you're going to repress that, because shame and guilt are negative feelings. We don't like them. They don't feel good. They don't make us, put us in good headspace. So as a self-protective mechanism, the psyche is going to repress the emotions that lead to those experiences. And so the anger, the depression, the sadness, the anxiety, all those feelings are going to be suppressed so that we don't experience the negative side effects that we come to learn through our primary caregivers are the results of those experiences. Under such conditions, emotional competence will be compromised. The individual will not, in the future, know how to effectively handle the feelings and desires involved. The result would be a kind of helplessness. And I hear that all the time here in my sessions, in my comments. Idea they might not use the word helplessness, but that is the underlying emotion that I can sense. This feeling of I can't do it anymore. I don't know what to do about it. I've read the books, I've done the work, and I'm still here stuck in this cycle, right, of shame, of guilt, of a lack of energy, lack of motivation, of people pleasing, of the inability to say no, of the inability to express anger. All that, it all falls under the same umbrella, the suppression of emotion and this kind of helplessness. The stress literature amply documents that helplessness, real or perceived, as a potent trigger for biological stress responses. Learned helplessness is a psychological state in which subjects do not extricate themselves from stressful situations even when they have the physical opportunity to do so. And we see that in abusive relationships, right? We've all heard of the people or know the people who continue to stay in relationships that do not serve them, even when they have the quote-unquote opportunity to leave. People often find themselves in situations of learned helplessness. For example, someone who feels stuck in a dysfunctional or even abusive relationship, in a stressful job, or in a lifestyle that robs him or her of true freedom. Oof. And so, we'll end today on this. Thank you, Glam. Emotional competence requires. So this is kind of like the first insight into what's the healing process. There's a lot of this book is about this is the problem. These are the ways the problems manifest. So this is the first kind of little insight into what's the solution. So emotional competence requires the capacity to feel our emotions so that we are aware when we are experiencing stress, the ability to express our emotions effectively and thereby to assert our needs and to maintain the integrity of our emotional boundaries, the facility to distinguish between psychological reactions that are pertinent to the present situation and those that represent residue from the past. Meaning, so if you get triggered by a partner or something that happens out in the world, is the event that actually happened, is that really a problem? Is it really as big as it feels in our body? Or is it just directing us towards repressed trauma, repressed emotions that we haven't fully expressed? It's an important question. What we want and demand from the world needs to conform to our present needs, not to unconscious, unsatisfied needs from childhood. If distinctions between past and present blur, we will perceive loss or the threat of loss where none exists. And the awareness that those genuine needs that do require satisfaction rather than their repression for the sake of gaining the acceptance or approval of others. Stress occurs in the absence of these criteria, and it leads to the disruption of homeostasis. Chronic disruption results in ill health. Emotional competence is what we need to develop if we are to protect ourselves from the hidden stress that creates a risk to health, and is what we need to regain if we are to heal. We need to foster emotional competence in our children as the best preventive medicine. And of course, we need to do it for ourselves first before we do it for our children. We can't learn how to do it for our children until we learn how to do it for ourselves. So good.